Warning, there will be spoilers in this video. Although the shows that I'm about to discuss have been out for many years, some people may not have watched them and they may still be on their watch list. So if you are yet to finish or watch Attack on Titan, Dexter, Death Note, or you have been warned. Have you ever found yourself rooting for a character despite the fact that they want to destroy humanity? Well, I have. In contemporary media, audiences often find themselves rooting for protagonists who can commit acts of violence, manipulation, and even murder. Characters such as Eren Yeager, Dexter Morgan, Light Yagami, and Joe Goldberg challenge traditional notions of morality and force viewers to question their own ethical boundaries. Despite how creepy we may find Joe from You, or how egotistical we may find Light from Death Note, we still root for them deep down, even when acknowledging their flaws. In this video, we will explore why we root for these morally flawed characters despite their actions, how narrative perspective manipulates our moral judgment, and also why we may ultimately reject them when they cross certain moral lines. The power of perspective. Why we initially root for the anti-hero. Stuart Hall argued that audiences interpret media differently dependent on how narratives are encoded by creators. In simple terms, this means that the way a story is told or encoded by creators influences how audiences understand and interpret or decode the story. In the cases of anti-heroes, shows like Dexter, You, and Death Note encode these characters as protagonists, providing us with direct access to their thoughts, motivations, and emotional struggles. For example, in You, Joe Goldberg's internal monologue frames his stalking and murder as acts of love and protection. This manipulation of narrative perspective forces audiences to decode his actions as somewhat justified, despite their inherent immorality. This narrative strategy is also employed in Dexter and Death Note, where the protagonists, Dexter Morgan and Light Yagami, constantly justify their actions to themselves and therefore by extension to the audience. In Dexter, we are given near constant access to Dexter's internal thoughts, which shapes how we perceive his actions. As he was quote-unquote born in blood, Dexter is driven with the innate need to kill. However, he devises a code with his father, Harry Morgan, to avoid getting caught by taking out other murderers like a vigilante rather than a psychopath. He rationalizes the murders he commits, therefore, as necessary evil, carefully selecting his victims based on a moral code, only killing those who deserve it. Because we hear his reasoning directly, we are led to view his actions as controlled, calculated, and even justified, rather than purely psychopathic. When Dexter makes mistakes, such as accidentally murdering an innocent, we see him battle with guilt, further suggesting that he does have some sense of morality. This adds a complex layer to his character, leading audiences to sympathize with the struggles he faces when he makes mistakes, rather than sympathize with the victims of his murder, even when those victims are innocent. However, as the show goes on, we realise that Dexter is coming to this conclusion that the rule "don't get caught" is sometimes more important than only killing those who deserve it. This narrative device ensures that his enemies, such as James Dokes, are framed as obstacles rather than heroes, maintaining Dexter's hero image within the series. Despite Dokes being morally correct in suspecting Dexter, we never fully side with him because we are emotionally aligned with Dexter's perspective. This may also be because Dokes is framed as an enemy from the get-go, being the only detective in a precinct of cops that finds Dexter weird and therefore mistreats him. Within this storyline in particular, we watch Dexter struggle with how he's going to deal with Dokes, knowing that he is the Bay Harbor Butcher. On the one hand, Dokes is an innocent, only killing those whilst he's on duty and not as part of an innate need, so he doesn't fit Dexter's code. Though Dexter weighs up the pros and cons of handing himself in order to reckon with this moral dilemma, he ultimately comes to the conclusion that killing Dokes would cause less harm than the world discovering that Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor Butcher. And this is where that key rule, "don't get caught," becomes more important than only killing those that deserve it. However, Dexter never ends up making that decision, and instead ends up killing Lila, who takes out Dokes herself. In Death Note, the use of internal monologues is more complex. Whilst we primarily follow Light Yagami's perspective, we also hear the thoughts of other key characters, in particular Al. This creates a moral tension that is not present in Dexter or You, where internal monologues are also used. Whereas Light's internal monologue leads us to understand his belief that he is creating a perfect world, Al's internal monologue offers an alternative view, portraying Light as relentless and a dangerous individual. This dual perspective arguably complicates audience perception and therefore allegiance. At least it did in my case. However, because Light is still the focal point of the series, we may still instinctively root for him, even when his actions become more ruthless. The more time that we spend inside his mind, the more we understand and perhaps excuse his actions, even as he manipulates and kills innocent people. Though his decision to take up people that get in his way clearly shows us that his moral compass is heavily swayed by his godlike ego, we continue to be blown away by his intelligence and strategy, such as the way he manipulates Ren into killing Al for him, which then ends with Ren being killed too, ultimately hitting two birds with one stone, or how he strategically clears his name by erasing his memory of the Death Note, has it taken to someone else who is then framed as the real killer, and then has the Death Note returned to him, ensuring that his memories are returned to him as well. I don't know about anyone else that's watched Death Note, but when I watched that for the first time, I was like, fucking hell, that dude is smart. I'd argue that as Light's morality weakens, his intelligence falters, and his ego spirals out of control, we begin to see him more as a villain, and eventually understand and make peace with him getting caught and dying. Though personally, I felt disappointed by that ending, as it goes against the complex, intelligent character that we have come to know and understand. But that's a whole other discussion. This contrasts with shows like You, where we are never given access to the thoughts of Joe's victims. If we ever heard Beck's or Love's internal monologue, our perception of Joe would likely shift, as we would no longer be trapped inside his justification process. Though personally I feel like Joe is a character that we hate to love. We are shown the flaws of Beck and Love, arguably justifying why he hurts and kills them. Yet, I believe we may have rooted for Love regardless, especially when we see her spare Marianne. Perhaps this is why we only see Joe as a narrator. Could it be that he would not be likeable enough for us to root for if we did see the inner monologue of the women that he torments? Why do we still support these characters despite their flaws? Despite perspective having a huge impact on how we root for these anti-heroes, we are still exposed to their flaws. This arguably makes them less palatable or shows us reasons why we should not support them. Yet, when Eren Yeager makes the decision to trample the entire world outside of the walls, part of us wants him to succeed. And if not succeed, at least survive. Parasocial Relationship Theory explains how audiences form one-side emotional bonds with fictional characters as if they were real people. Because we spend so much time inside the minds of these anti-heroes, we begin to understand their motivations, their fears and traumas, which allows us to emotionally justify their actions, even when they're morally reprehensible. In Attack on Titan, the power of perspective is key in understanding why audiences continue to root for Eren Yeager, even when he commits mass genocide. We spend the majority of the series seeing the world through Eren's eyes, from his childhood trauma of witnessing his mother's death at the hands of the Titans, to his growing hatred towards the Malians who oppressed his people. As Parasocial Relationship Theory suggests, this constant access to Eren's internal struggles fosters an emotional connection between the audience and Eren, allowing us to justify his increasingly violent actions as a response to years of suffering and oppression. However, Attack on Titan complicates this perspective by later introducing the Marleyan Eldians, such as Gabby Braun and Falco Grice, and delving into the emotional struggles of Rainer Braun and Annie Leonhardt. Through these characters, we begin to understand that the Marleyans too are victims of systemic oppression and fear, manipulated into believing that the Eldians on Paradis are devils. Despite this, audiences struggle to form the same emotional bonds with Gabby and Rainer, for example, because we haven't been given the same level of narrative intimacy as we have with Eren. In fact, many viewers initially despise Gabby, and continue to do so, not because her actions are inherently worse than Eren's, but because we lack access to her internal monologue and emotional journey until much later in the series. At this point, our parasocial bond with Eren is already solidified, making it difficult to shift our allegiance even when we are presented with morally superior perspectives. This highlights the manipulative power of narrative perspective. Had the series begun from Rainer's point of view, for example, showing his internal conflict as a child soldier forced to infiltrate Paradis, it is likely that Eren would be viewed as the true antagonist, and the audience's emotional alignment would shift. This reinforces the idea that our empathy is not rooted in morality, but in the proximity to the characters' experiences. Our initial exposure to Rainer and Annie's actions, for example, are framed as in opposition to Eren and the good guys. We have no understanding of why, at the time, the trio infiltrated the wall to Shiganshina, or why Annie brutally murders Levi's squad and other members of the Scout Regiment. But we do find this out afterwards, meaning that the views that we had on Annie and Rainer, for example, in the past cannot be changed, even if the future can be reflected as such. In contrast, we follow Eren throughout. So when he murders the people of Liberio, eats Willy Tiber and causes destruction in Marley, this is the first time we witness him murdering innocent people, and we understand why. This understanding of his motivations allows us to make peace with it, because at the time of the action, we get the motivation. However, at the time of the Armored Titans, the Colossal Titans, and the Female Titans' actions, we didn't know their motivations, outside the fact that they are enemies to the people of Paradis. Similarly, in You, Joe Goldberg's internal narration manipulates the audience into viewing his stalking, manipulation, and murder as acts of love and protection. Through constant access to Joe's thoughts and his reflections on his abusive childhood and social isolation, we are encouraged not to see him as a predator, but as a misunderstood romantic. Because the narrative frames Joe as a victim of circumstance, audiences find themselves justifying his increasingly horrific actions. In Dexter, this emotional manipulation is even more explicit. Dexter's internal monologue allows us to rationalise his murders as morally justified, as he only kills those who deserve it, criminals who have escaped justice. However, what truly blurs the moral line is our understanding of Dexter's childhood trauma. Having witnessed his mother's brutal murder and been conditioned by his adoptive father to channel his violent urges towards righteous targets, Dexter is presented not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man struggling to control his inner darkness. Parasocial Relationship Theory explains why audiences develop emotional connections with characters like Dexter, despite their immorality. We empathise with Dexter's pain and accept his need to kill as a coping mechanism for his trauma. In each case, the narrative perspective shapes our moral alignment. By granting us access to the anti-hero's internal world, these stories blur the lines between morality and empathy, leading us to justify actions like murder and manipulation. This raises an important question. Do we truly support these characters, or are we simply manipulated by the narrative's framing? Where do we begin to reject these characters? Despite the access to internal monologues and the development of parasocial connections, we do at some points reject these anti-heroes and start to see the perspectives of those who are framed as obstacles. Cognitive dissonance theory explains how individuals experience psychological discomfort when their beliefs or emotional investment in a character are challenged by actions that contradict their moral values. This theory is key to understanding why, despite initially rooting for anti-heroes like Eren Yeager, Light Yagami, and Joe Goldberg, audiences eventually begin to emotionally detach from them as their actions become increasingly unjustifiable. In Attack on Titan, Eren's character arc is built around the justifiable pursuit of freedom and justice for the oppressed audience. For much of the series, audiences sympathise with Eren due to his trauma and desire to protect his loved ones, which does align with traditional heroic motivations. However, cognitive dissonance begins to emerge when Eren begins to treat his fellow hero characters badly and initiates the rumbling, leading to the mass genocide of innocent civilians, including children and those with no connection to Marley's oppression of Eldians. This extreme shift from freedom fighter to mass murderer causes moral discomfort in the audience, as we can no longer reconcile with Eren's actions with the emotional bond that we formed with him. At this point, audiences begin to emotionally detach from Eren and shift their allegiance towards more morally grounded characters like Armin and Mikasa, who actively tried to stop him, though many would argue that they still continue to back Eren because he doesn't waver from his original intention to be free. Eren has grown up believing that the world outside the walls has no humanity left. Therefore, it's there, ready to be explored. Once they can eradicate the Titans, they will have enough land for livestock and housing, and things like poverty and the struggles that they face within the walls will be a thing of the distant past. So when he sees the outside world and realises that that is not the case, it's kind of understandable why he can't reconcile with his previous expectations. And he is also exposed to the world outside of Paradis as one that frames the Eldians of Paradis as devils that can never be trusted. As we begin to see that the world will never change their mind, we become morally clouded when it comes to Eren's decision. Despite all his flaws, he sticks to his guns and continues moving forward, as that's all he can do. And as we see Paradis destroyed in the end of the credits, it seems that Eren's decision to wipe out the rest of the world would be the only thing to protect Paradis of reprisal, despite the fact that Eldians can no longer turn into Titans and therefore would not be a threat to the rest of the world. It's easy to come to such conclusions when we're talking about fiction. If framed within real life, I would hope that many of us would not root for mass genocide of the rest of the world, even if they sought out our extinction. A similar pattern occurs in Death Note. In the early episodes, audiences are drawn to Light Yagami's sense of justice as he uses the Death Note to eliminate criminals who have escaped punishment. However, the turning point comes when Light begins to kill innocent people. The moral justification for his actions collapses, as Light's motivations shift from creating a better world to maintaining his own godlike power. Cognitive dissonance sets in as audiences can no longer rationalize Light's actions as morally justified, leading to a gradual shift towards Al and other characters working to stop him. I feel like this was the point of the show though. The focus was never really on Light ridding the world from criminals, as most of it was taken up by eliminating those that defied him or those that could catch him, such as Al and later N and Mello. In You, Joe Goldberg's character similarly manipulates the audience's empathy through his internal monologue and tragic backstory of abuse and social isolation. At first, his obsessive stalking and killing are framed as acts of love and protection. However, cognitive dissonance emerges when Joe kills Beck and other innocent women, revealing that his actions are not rooted in love but in control and possession. At this point, the audience's emotional bond with Joe begins to fracture, if there was one in the first place. Personally, I always found him a bit creepy, but that's just me. But the show's narrative framing still tempts us to hope that he will escape justice. In each of these cases, The audience's moral discomfort intensifies when the anti-hero crosses an ethical boundary that can no longer be justified by their trauma or motivations. However, what makes characters like Eren and Light particularly compelling is that we don't fully abandon them, as the narrative has already forged a deep emotional connection. Instead, we experience internal conflict, torn between the character we once rooted for and the undeniable consequences of their actions. This emotional detachment from the anti-hero often leads to a subconscious shift in audience allegiance, whether that be to Armin and Mikasa in Attack on Titan, L in Death Note, or even Love Quinn in You. However, the fact that we still feel conflicted about these characters, even as they commit horrific acts, highlights the manipulative power of narrative perspective and the complexities of audience morality. This dissonance doesn't occur in Dexter, even when Dexter Morgan kills an innocent character. Why? The key lies in what we've already discussed, the narrative framing and the audience manipulation through perspective. From the get-go, we are placed inside Dexter's internal monologue, so we understand his strict moral code, what he calls the Code of Harry, which dictates that he should only kill those who deserve it. However, when LaGuerta, a morally righteous police officer, is killed by Deb in order to protect Dexter, or when Dexter debates killing Dokes, and when he kills innocent people, this directly violates his code. In theory, this should trigger cognitive dissonance, but it doesn't. This is because the narrative remains locked within Dexter's perspective, and characters like LaGuerta and Dokes are framed as obstacles to Dexter's survival, rather than true moral authority. In terms of LaGuerta's death, at this point the audience has spent 7 seasons building up a parasocial bond with Dexter, understanding his trauma and need to kill as a result of witnessing his mother's brutal murder as a child. But LaGuerta, on the other hand, is a secondary character whose perspective we rarely get access to. Therefore, the audience perceives her not as an innocent victim, but as a threat to Dexter's survival and identity. Additionally, LaGuerta's character arc is written in a way that aligns her with the antagonist role, as she becomes obsessed with exposing Dexter as the Bay Harbor Butcher, very similar to Dokes. This subtly manipulates the audience into rooting against her, despite the fact that she's morally in the right. This connects us back to Stuart Hall's Encoding Decoding Model, which argues that audiences are influenced by the way narratives are encoded by creators. The showrunners intentionally encode LaGuerta and Dokes as antagonists within the context of Dexter's story, leading the audience to decode their deaths as justified rather than tragic. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, Dexter's internal moral struggle after killing or causing the death of innocent people is framed as a moment of emotional vulnerability rather than cold-blooded murder. This allows the audience to empathize with Dexter's pain and fear of losing those he loves, rather than feeling disgusted by his actions. The role of philosophy. Do we see these characters as above morality? Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of Übermensch, or Superman, presents an individual who rises above the constraints of conventional morality, creating their own values and principles independent of social norms. Nietzsche's idea is rooted in the rejection of traditional moral systems, such as those shaped by religion and social conventions, and instead encourages individuals to assert their will and shape the world according to their own unique vision. This concept has resonated with many fictional characters, including those who regularly challenge societal structures or morality for a higher purpose. 2 such characters are Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan and Light Yagami from Death Note, both of whom arguably embody elements of Übermensch philosophy. At the beginning of the series, Eren is motivated by a basic sense of revenge and justice, seeking to protect people from the Titans. However, as the story progresses, particularly in the later seasons, Eren's philosophy grows more darker and more complex. complex. He comes to believe that the only way to truly free his people from the cycle of oppression is through mass genocide, using the power of the founding titan to annihilate entire populations. Eren's perspective aligns with Nietzsche's notion of transcending traditional morality. He may view his actions, no matter how violent or destructive, as justified because they serve the higher purpose, the freedom and survival of his people. By choosing the path of destruction over preservation, Eren creates his own moral code. The belief that his actions are justified, even when they directly oppose the conventional understanding of right and wrong, echoes the idea of Übermensch rejecting established moral systems in favour of a personal vision of what is necessary. This transition from hero to anti-hero also raises questions about the price of individual autonomy. As Eren embraces his role as an agent of destruction, he loses his connection to the more relatable human aspects of his character, and arguably, because the narrative no longer focuses on him, but on his friends, we kind of lose a bit of touch with him. This shift emphasises the isolation that comes with transcending traditional morality. Ultimately, Eren becomes a figure who stands apart, not just from society, but from his former self. I do realise though that the application of this philosophy to Eren's character relies on Eren's actions being his own choice. However, by the end of the show we are led to question whether these actions were the choice of Eren. Were they predetermined? Was it Ymir that decided this, or a greater good? Or was it Eren's younger self that decided this? And we do see Eren struggle with this, especially when he admits that he believes that this is already decided. When speaking with Armin through the power of the founding titan, we see that no matter what he does, everything happens as his memories of the future dictates. This may lead to audiences realising that Eren does not have control over his decisions, so rooting for him is not necessarily about rooting for his inhumane decisions. If he no longer has control over his own will then, we can still argue that this philosophy still applies to him. He does transcend traditional morality as a slave to freedom, as morality now has nothing to do with his actions and his current morality does not control them, but the predetermined future. Also, what he can control, such as pushing his friends away, which results in them fighting against him, also transcends traditional morality. He sees his treatment of his friends as a means to a desired end. If they are seen as the forces of paradis that stop the rumbling, they will not be persecuted and will be able to live long and happy lives, which is basically all Eren wanted all along, for those that were close to him to live long and happy lives. His way of achieving this is morally ambiguous at best, but can still be viewed through Nietzsche's Übermensch as transcending traditional morality in order to achieve a greater good. But again, was this his choice? Was he able to do this as a key motivation of his was the protection of his loved ones? Or was it determined all along? Similarly, Light Yagami from Death Note is another character that embodies Nietzsche's Übermensch, but in a slightly different form, and arguably in a much clearer one, where there are questions regarding how much of Eren's actions were a result of his own choices. Light's actions are framed as solely his own. At the beginning of Death Note, Light is portrayed as a brilliant and idealistic student who believes in justice. When he acquires the Death Note, a supernatural notebook that allows him to kill anyone by writing their name, Light sees it as an opportunity to rid the world of criminals and create a utopia. Light rejects traditional moral frameworks, seeing himself as a force of justice who is above the law and morality. He becomes convinced that he is destined to be a god, using his new power to reshape the world according to his vision of justice. Throughout the series, Light's sense of superiority grows. He views himself as a divine arbiter, punishing the wicked in a way that he believes transcends human understanding. His belief that only he has the the right to decide who lives and dies reflects the Übermensch's ability to create their own values, independent of conventional moral structure. Light's actions are justified in his mind because he is saving the world from corruption. The show portrays his moral decline as he becomes increasingly ruthless, manipulating others and embracing violence, all for the sake of his utopian vision. Nietzsche would argue that Light has ascended to a higher state of being, but his descent into tyranny and manipulation also illustrates the dangers of being disconnected from traditional moral constraints. What may draw audiences to characters like Eren and Light is their embodiment of Nietzsche's idea of Übermensch, an individual who rejects the constraints of society to create their own values. These characters challenge traditional notions of good and evil, forcing viewers to grapple with the complexities of moral judgment. In a world where individuals often feel powerless against larger systems of oppression or corruption, characters like Eren and Light may represent a form of rebellion that they can relate to. They symbolize the desire for agency and control in a world where traditional structures seem flawed or unjust. Moreover, Nietzsche's Übermensch is not meant to be a role model, but rather a provocative concept that forces society to question its values. Eren and Light both embody this ambiguity, as their actions may be justified from their perspective, but are deeply problematic from a broader ethical viewpoint. Their journeys ask important philosophical questions. Can the end justify the means? Is it possible to transcend morality without becoming a tyrant? What has determined the future? Is a moral standpoint so strong that it can cause such derailment in ethics? Looking at another concept then, in her 1963 work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil, philosopher Hannah Arendt introduced the concept of the banality of evil. Arendt observed that Adolf Eichmann, a key figure in organising the Holocaust, was not a monstrous, inherently evil person, but rather an ordinary bureaucrat who believed he was simply doing his job. Though, I don't know, doing something like that as part of your job is evil to me, but hey ho. Arendt argued that evil acts are often committed by individuals who, rather than acting out of a deep malice or hatred, are simply following orders or rationalising their actions as necessary for a greater good. In this sense, evil can appear banal, not as an outpouring of hatred or psychopathy, but as a thoughtless, routine action carried out by ordinary people with a misguided sense of morality. This idea has profound implications for understanding characters like Joe Goldberg from You, Light Yagami from Death Note, and Dexter Morgan from Dexter. These characters rationalise their acts of violence and murder in a way that makes them appear more human, less monstrous, and often more sympathetic to audiences. Their actions are not always motivated by uncontrollable rage or a thirst for chaos, but by a carefully constructed justification that seems logical to them, and this rationalisation makes their actions appear more morally ambiguous. Joe Goldberg, the central character in You, offers a chilling example of the banality of evil in practice. Joe's violent actions are portrayed as the result of his deep obsession with the woman he becomes infatuated with. He rationalises his actions, murdering those who get in his way or threaten his relationships as acts of love or protection. Through the series, Joe frequently convinces himself that he is saving the women he loves from the dangers of the world or from the people who would harm them. He doesn't see himself as a murderer, but as someone correcting wrongs, creating a safer world for the object of his affection. In Joe's mind, the brutality of his actions are justified by the purity of his feelings. He views his killings as logical, almost necessary steps in his quest for love, which echoes Arendt's idea of ordinary individuals committing evil acts while firmly believing they are acting in the service of some higher or moral purpose. And the fact that Joe often recoils at the idea of dead bodies, how he is disgusted with Love's actions of killing others, kind of gives us a complex idea of his character, where his killings are not seen as murder or wrong, but when he sees the physical implications of the murder, we see him physically reject it. Joe's rationalization makes him a character whose actions are easy to sympathize with, even as the audience recoils at his violence. His persona is far from the stereotypical rage-driven psychopath. Instead, he presents a deeply conflicted, emotionally damaged individual who justifies his actions through the lens of love, making his evil more banal and less overtly monstrous. Light Yagami from Death Note offers another example of the banality of evil in practice. Light begins his journey with a sense of deep justice, believing that by eradicating evil he is essentially bringing about a utopia, where he stands as a godlike figure, a deity who decides who lives and who dies. In his eyes, his actions are righteous, as he is eradicating evil and preserving order, and anybody that goes against him is truly the evil one because they are preventing him from creating this utopia. Light's sense of morality is rooted in a highly rational, almost utilitarian worldview. He believes that by controlling life and death, he can make the world a better place. Like Joe, he sees his violent acts as logical steps towards a greater good, rather than the acts of an emotional outburst. In fact, most of Light's murders are calculated and methodical, devoid of the kind of impulsive rage that might mark a traditionally villainous character. And the fact that he doesn't physically murder these people himself also adds to this methodology. This detachment from personal animus makes his actions appear less monstrous and more like the actions of a cold, rational figure, further enabling audience sympathy. However, as his character evolves, the rationalization of his killings becomes increasingly tenuous. His sense of superiority grows, and his conviction that he is right blinds him to the moral consequences of his actions. And arguably, some of his other actions are quite immoral, such as the way he treats Mr. Amane and manipulates the women around him into doing his bidding. His rationalization of mass murder as an act of justice mirrors Arendt's idea that evil can often be the result of a bureaucratic mindset. One where individuals stop questioning the morality of their actions because they are so consumed with the logic of their self-constructed moral system. Light's evil is banal because it emerges from a deeply flawed, self-justifying belief system, not from a pure hatred or irrational madness. Dexter Morgan from Dexter is perhaps the clearest embodiment of Arendt's banality of evil theory. Dexter, a serial killer, justifies his murders through a strict moral code. He only kills criminals who have escaped justice. His code, which was instilled in him by his adoptive father, Harry, allows him to maintain a sense of righteousness in the midst of his violent actions. 99% of the time, Dexter does not act impulsively. His murders are premeditated, deliberate, and carried out with precision and detachment. Throughout the series, Dexter rationalizes his killing as unnecessary to rid the world of criminals who would otherwise continue to harm innocent people, sometimes meddling in police investigations so that he could rid the world of the criminal himself, which unfortunately has very dire consequences. His belief in his own moral superiority, combined with his cold, precise nature, reflects Arendt's argument that evil is often the result of thoughtlessness, bureaucracy, and a failure to question one's actions. Though we could also argue that Dexter does reflect on his actions and does know that his innate need to kill is wrong. His decision to do it to people that hurt others is more of a justification for his innate need to kill, rather than a sense of moral superiority. But as the seasons go on, we realise how important it is for Dexter to save certain people, particularly children. When we see Dexter's emotional detachment from some of his murders, it can make him more of a relatable figure, and paradoxically, his logic-driven justification makes his actions seem less monstrous than they would be if they were motivated by unchecked rage or sadistic pleasure. His moral code and the way he rationalizes his killings, no matter how flawed, render his violence more banal and less horrific, even though he's taking lives. This allows the audience to view him as a complicated, perhaps even sympathetic character, which is perhaps in stark contrast to traditional villains whose actions are motivated by irrational hatred or sadism. The concept of banality of evil allows us to understand why audiences are often drawn to characters like Joe, Light and Dexter despite their murderous actions. Their violence is framed not as an emotional outburst or a response to a personal trauma in this case, but as a logical outcome of their moral philosophies. These characters justify their actions with clear, rational rationale, whether it's love, justice, or a moral code, which humanises them in a way that makes their evil feel less monstrous. Arendt's theory reminds us that evil is not always an overt, dramatic force, but can emerge from seemingly normal people who are simply following a set of rules or rationalising their behaviour. In the case of Joe, Light and Dexter, this rationalisation makes their actions feel less impulsive and more thought out. And it enables the audience to sympathise with them on some level, even as they commit horrific acts of violence. By framing their murders as calculated, logical decisions, the show allows viewers to engage with these characters as morally complex individuals rather than outright villains, further blurring the lines between good and evil. To conclude, the reason why we root for anti-heroes like Eren Yeager, Light Yagami, Dexter Morgan and Joe Goldberg is not because we are drawn to evil as per se, but because narrative perspective, emotional manipulation and philosophical framing allows us to justify their actions. However, when these characters cross certain moral boundaries such as genocide or killing innocent people, audiences may begin to experience moral discomfort and detach from them. At least that's what the theories that we've covered may suggest. But what do you think? If you know these characters or are passionate about these shows, leave some comments down below on your thoughts of why we sympathise with them, whether we do back them or we just continue watching to see what's going to happen. Thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like and subscribe if you're new. And with that, I'll see you soon.